Hey everybody, John Pluskina here. And I recently discovered that professors at big universities like Harvard and Yale have been uploading videos of their lectures to YouTube. So I can see how this would be useful for them because their students can review the lectures, students who miss class can catch up, and a professor could potentially build a following on the internet under the right circumstances, like Jordan Peterson. Now, I love it when things like this happen because what we're seeing is the institutions of higher learning are becoming increasingly irrelevant as information moves to the internet where it can be freely shared and readily accessed and searched by anyone who takes the initiative to learn for themselves. So, although I'm pessimistic and indeed terrified about the future of Western civilization in many key respects, this is the kind of thing that gives me hope. I'm very excited to see what a society will look like when anyone can learn anything at any time. So since Gandhi said you need to be the change you want to see in the world, I've decided to take political science courses at Yale. Because why not? So if you want to take political science at Yale, I provide links in the description of this video. Now, conspicuously absent in these political science courses is a working definition for government or state. So right off the bat, we have an unquestioned assumption. So since the Ivy Leaguers didn't bother, we'll work from my definition of state, which is an oligarchy that has convinced the human population in an arbitrarily defined geographical area that it has the moral authority to initiate the use of force. Now, the first lecture provides an overview of the most common justifications for the existence of governments, the typical lines of reasoning to explain why a political regime is legitimate. Now, as an anarchist, I believe that there is no justification for the existence of governments. So I'm just going to refute them all. Number one, the utilitarian justification. Utilitarians believe that a state regime is legitimate if it works towards the good of its own citizens. The goal of a utilitarian state would be to maximize the utility or happiness present in society through state action. Now, there's some obvious problems with this. Namely, what does happiness mean? What does utility mean? What does it mean for the state to work toward a common good? The history of utilitarian thought is filled with arguments on precisely these points. That's because words like happiness and good are highly subjective. What makes one person or group of people happy is potentially very different from what would make other groups of people happy. Really, society only exists in abstract. In the real world, society is an intricate and unknowably complex interweaving of individuals and groups, all cooperating and competing with one another. Everyone has their own motivations and goals. Human needs and desires are infinite, while resources, on the other hand, are finite. There is no way to make everyone happy or for the government to act in ways that benefit everyone. So in practice, the people with political power will always be the people most skillful at seizing political power. That will necessarily be their key competency, because some people just enjoy bossing others around. And when you have an institution in society with the moral authority to initiate the use of force, it will attract power-hungry bullies the way that shit attracts flies. Power can even be addictive, like gambling or sex. So in a democracy, that means that the best liars, manipulators, and glad-handers will be the ones using state power to advance the common good. In other forms of government, it usually means the most violent, murderous scumbags, who then hand it down to their pampered and mentally ill children. So even if there were actions that could be taken to benefit the common good of all or a great majority of the citizens in a given society, the ruling class would be the people least suited to determining what those actions are and to implement those changes in society. Number two, the Marxist justification. Now, Marxists assert that legitimacy of a given state comes from the presence or absence of exploitation in society. In the Marxist view, the bourgeoisie class owns the means of production, and they, by definition, exploit the laborers that they hire in return for a wage. As a result, Marxists advocate for the use of state power for the redistribution of resources so that everyone has a fair and equitable outcome. Now, Marxist states are subject to the same issues as utilitarian states, with a few other points of catastrophic failure thrown in for good measure. Now, I know some people are going to hate me for saying this, but smart and hardworking people will always find ways to better themselves and acquire more resources for themselves and their families. And in a state where wealth is redistributed, resources are violently seized from them and given away. Now, as a result, people who are lazy, people who aren't that smart, people who aren't ambitious or industrious, benefit from the hard work of others. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that everyone who's poor is lazy or incompetent, especially not in this crappy economy. But in a society with wealth redistribution, both the rewards for hard work and the consequences for laziness, ignorance, and bad decision-making are dulled. Now, here in the United States, we see that poverty declined sharply before Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty. Nearly 100 million people have received welfare benefits since that time, at a cost of over $22 trillion. Now, note that even as total spending on means-tested welfare has increased exponentially, the poverty rate remains more or less consistent over time. But the most destructive aspect of the welfare state isn't the amount of money that gets thrown in it. It's the loss of marketable job skills. When unemployment continues for generation after generation, people forget how to type up a resume, how to talk at a job interview, why you need to show up on time, how to treat a customer, and so on. Meanwhile, the poverty rate among Americans who finish high school, get some kind of job and keep it, and avoid having children before they get married, is negligible. The welfare state exists because it creates a permanent underclass, which can be exploited by politicians for life. The ruling class tries to trick you into thinking that all you have to do to solve social problems is give them more money and power and control over the economy. They then proceed to half-ass it and use their authority to start endless wars. So we have a contradiction at the core of Marxist thought. Wealth redistribution doesn't end exploitation, it enables exploitation. Number 3, the social contract. Now, social contract theory states that the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. The United States was founded on this principle, and this is actually a pretty easy one to refute. If the citizens consent to the actions taken by the government, why do we need law enforcement? Now, in practice, the Constitution was negotiated almost 300 years ago. I didn't have a say in it. Now, there's a lot to like there, but there's some things I'd change, and some things that I'd add. I didn't have a voice in the negotiations, but I'm still bound by the government that it created, even though that government has far overreached its boundaries. I don't consent to the war on drugs. I don't consent to the welfare state. I don't consent to bombing third world countries on flimsy rationalizations. I don't consent to having half my income stolen from me. These initiatives started before I was even born, and I've never had a real option to vote against them in my lifetime. So what government agency do I contact to let them know that I withdraw my consent? Another thing to keep in mind, consent can be manufactured through the use of propaganda. Check out my documentary about the information ghetto to learn more about that. Of course, there's a link in the description. Number 4, tradition. In other words, the government is legitimate because it's old. This is hashtag not an argument.
Not an argument!
The fact that people have done something for a long time does not put moral imperative on me. Genital mutilation is tradition. So is slavery. I reserve the right to reject any and all traditions on my own terms. Number 5, might makes right. The government is legitimate because it's powerful enough to compel people to follow its laws. Yep, in reality, this is the only coherent justification for the existence of a state. Everything else is a rationalization. Governments use a combination of propaganda and violence to compel citizens to do as they're told. Sometimes you agree with what the government's doing. A lot of the time, you don't, even in a democracy. But your opinion doesn't actually matter all that much in the end, does it? But hey, free speech is a powerful tool and one that wasn't always available to those of us who question the powers that be. Politics is downstream from culture. The culture changes first, and the ruling class adjusts their tactics and rationalizations to maximize their own benefit. So as a musician, a YouTuber, and an author, I oppose the ruling class by using my speech to try and change the culture. If I can use my philosophy and my art to convince people that the government's power is not legitimate, then nation-states will just wither away. Hey, it could happen. Well, probably not in my lifetime, but maybe if enough anarchists, artists, and philosophers keep the fire of human liberty burning, we can rid our societies of the cancer of state power slowly and peacefully for our great grandchildren. Although, the internet is causing society to evolve very quickly, and sometimes radical change does happen rapidly. So, who knows? But for now, that's all I got. It's a harsh world out there, my friends. Nation states exist in it. Better keep thinking.